The morning they escorted me out of the Calloway Group's head office in downtown Toronto, it was raining. Not the dramatic kind of rain you see in movies, just that gray, persistent drizzle that makes the whole city look like it's given up. I remember standing on Bay Street with a cardboard box under my arm, my badge already deactivated, watching the revolving door spin behind me like nothing had happened. Like 14 years of my life hadn't just been erased in a single 40-minute meeting. The box held a coffee mug my late mother had given me, a framed photo of my dog Biscuit, and a sticky note I'd written to myself years ago that said, "Keep going." I stared at that sticky note the whole cab ride home. I should back up. My name is Daniel Mercer. My grandfather, Owen Calloway, built Calloway Group from nothing, a small freight logistics company he started in Hamilton in 1971 with 2 trucks and a stubborn refusal to quit. By the time I was born, it had grown into one of the most respected mid-sized logistics and supply chain firms in Ontario. We weren't Bay Street elite. We weren't flashy. But we were solid, reliable, the kind of company that other companies called when they needed something done right. I grew up in that company, the way some kids grow up in their family's restaurant summers, filing paperwork, shadowing drivers on local routes, learning how freight manifests worked before I knew how to drive. My grandfather believed that anyone who wanted to lead Calloway had to understand every layer of it first. He used to say, "Daniel, a man who only knows the top floor doesn't know the building." I took that seriously. My older brother, Curtis, did not. Curtis was 5 years older than me and had our father's talent for walking into a room and making everyone believe he was the most important person in it. He was charming in the way that costs nothing and means nothing. He'd done an MBA at Western, wore it like a crown, and had spent most of his 20s positioning himself as the heir apparent to Calloway Group, while I was still in the trenches learning operations. Our father, Robert, ran the company as CEO after my grandfather stepped back to chairman. Robert was not a bad man, but he was a man who wanted peace more than he wanted truth, and that distinction would cost our family enormously. I joined full-time at 24 after finishing my degree in supply chain management at Ryerson. By 28, I was managing our largest contract, a partnership with a national retail chain called Norbridge that accounted for nearly 30% of Calloway's annual revenue. It had taken me 2 years to land that contract. 2 years of meetings, revised proposals, relationship building, and late nights running numbers that no one else wanted to run. The Norbridge contract was mine. Everyone in the company knew it. Then came the spring I was 31. Norbridge's procurement team flagged an error in a quarterly performance report I had submitted. Our on-time delivery rates had been recorded incorrectly, showing a 94.3% rate when the actual figure was 91.7%. The gap wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to put us in technical breach of the performance benchmarks in our service agreement. Norbridge sent a formal notice. What nobody outside of my immediate team knew was that the error hadn't come from my report. I had submitted the correct figures, 91.7%, along with a proactive improvement plan and a request to schedule a remediation meeting with Norbridge before the end of the quarter. That was standard practice. That was how I operated. Somewhere between my submission and the version that reached Norbridge, the numbers changed. I didn't know that yet when my father called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon and told me to close the door. My brother was already in the room. My father sat behind his desk looking the way he always looked when he wanted to avoid conflict, tired, soft around the eyes, like a man bracing for a storm he hoped would pass quickly. Curtis sat to the side with his arms crossed, wearing an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that takes practice. "The board met this morning," my father said. "Norbridge has escalated. They're threatening to trigger the exit clause in the contract." I told him I understood, and that I had already reached out to their team to schedule a remediation call. I had the documentation ready. We could address this. My father looked at Curtis, not at me. "The board feels," he said slowly, "that the account needs stronger leadership going forward." I asked what that meant. "They want Curtis to take over the Norbridge relationship, effective immediately." I sat there for a moment. I asked if there was going to be an internal review. I asked who had reviewed the report that reached Norbridge. I asked why the version they received was different from the one I submitted. My father said the priority right now was stabilizing the client relationship, not internal forensics. Curtis said nothing. He just looked at the wall just past my left shoulder. "We'd like you to transition to our Edmonton satellite office," my father continued. "Operations coordinator role. It's a solid position, Daniel. It's not a demotion in title." Edmonton. I had been managing a $30 million annual contract from our Toronto headquarters, and they wanted me to go coordinate operations at a satellite office 1,500 miles away. I told my father I wasn't going to Edmonton. He told me that if I declined the transfer, my separation package would be significantly reduced under the terms of my employment agreement, a clause he quoted from memory, which meant he had looked it up before this meeting. That detail has never left me. I walked out of that building the following Friday with my cardboard box and my sticky note. My grandfather called me that evening. He was 79 years old at the time, still sharp in the way of men who built things with their hands and their minds, and never fully stopped. He lived in a house in Ancaster, the same house he'd lived in since 1978, and he called me from the landline in his kitchen the way he always did. He didn't say much about what happened at the company. He asked how I was. He asked if I had savings. He told me the city was full of people who would recognize what I was worth. Then he said something that I didn't fully understand until much later. "Hold on to everything, Daniel. Every email, every document, every version of every file you touched. You understand me?" I told him I did. "Good," he said. "And be patient. Some things need time to become what they're supposed to become." I thought he was just being a grandfather. I didn't ask what he meant. I spent the first month after leaving Calloway in a kind of fog. I sublet an apartment near Bloor and Spadina, walked Biscuit along the Humber River Trail every morning, and tried to remember who I was outside of that company. It was harder than I expected. Calloway Group had been my identity for so long that without it I felt like a building that had lost its structural core, still standing, but not entirely sure how. But I had savings. I had the severance, reduced as it was. And I had a contact list built over 7 years of working the Norbridge account and every other relationship I'd developed in the Ontario logistics space. At 32, I started Meridian Supply Co. from a spare bedroom. I am not going to pretend it was romantic. The first year was grinding, humbling work. I was writing proposals at 2 in the morning, cold calling former contacts who remembered me from Calloway and were curious enough to take a meeting, and learning slowly, painfully, that building a company from nothing is a different skill than running a division inside an existing one. I made mistakes, real ones, not falsified ones. I owned every single one of them, but by the end of year 2, Meridian had 4 small to medium contracts and was generating enough revenue to hire my first 2 employees. By year 3, we were profitable. By year 5, we had an office in Mississauga and a client roster that included 2 national brands. I didn't speak to my brother during those years. I didn't speak to my father often. The conversations we did have were polite and hollow, like talking to someone through a closed window. My grandfather I called every Sunday. He always answered on the second ring. He asked about Meridian. He asked about Biscuit. He told me stories about the early years of Calloway, that I had never heard the contracts he'd lost. The winters, when he wasn't sure he could make payroll, the partners who had let him down, and the ones who hadn't. He was telling me something with those stories. I understood that, even if I didn't always understand exactly what. In my 5th year running Meridian, I received an email from a former Calloway operations analyst named Teresa Vo, who had left the company about 18 months after I did. Teresa was sharp, meticulous, the kind of person who noticed things other people didn't notice. She said she had something she thought I should see, and asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a place on King Street West on a gray November afternoon. She put a USB drive on the table between us. "I saved copies before I left," she said. "I wasn't sure why at the time. I just felt like I should." On that drive were the original performance reports I had submitted for the Norbridge account, the real ones, with the correct figures and the attached improvement plan and the remediation meeting request. Alongside them were the altered versions. The metadata showed the modification timestamps, the user credentials, and the device ID of the machine that had made the changes. The changes had been made from Curtis's workstation, 3 days before the report reached Norbridge. I sat with that information for a long time before I did anything with it. The honest answer to why I waited is this: I wasn't ready. Meridian needed me fully present, and I knew that if I pulled on that thread before I had the standing and the resources to do something meaningful with it, I would spend my energy on a fight I couldn't win. I also knew, though I couldn't have explained it fully, that my grandfather was still alive, still watching, and that whatever he was waiting for wasn't ready yet either. So I held on to the drive. I had it formally analyzed by a digital forensics firm in Waterloo. I had a lawyer review the findings. I organized everything into a file I kept on an encrypted drive in my desk drawer, and I waited. In my 7th year running Meridian, my grandfather had a heart attack. He survived, but it was serious enough that he spent 3 weeks in St. Joseph's Hospital in Hamilton, and the family gathered in ways that families gather when they know time is changing shape. I visited him 4 times during those 3 weeks. We talked about Biscuit, who had gone gray around the muzzle. We talked about the Leafs, which gave us both something to feel mildly frustrated about. We talked about Meridian's newest contract, a regional grocery distribution partnership that I was genuinely proud of. On my last visit before he was discharged, he held my hand in both of his and looked at me with the clear, precise attention he had always given to things that mattered. "I've been organizing my affairs," he said. "There are things in place that you don't know about yet. When the time comes, you'll understand." I told him I trusted him. He smiled. That's all I needed to hear. My grandfather died 14 months later, quietly, in his sleep, in the house in Ancaster. He was 82 years old. I got the call at 5:30 in the morning, and I sat on my apartment floor with Biscuit beside me for a long time before I could move. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. It was handled by my grandfather's longtime lawyer, a composed, precise woman named Margaret Osei, at her firm's offices in downtown Hamilton. Present were my father, my brother Curtis, my Aunt Patricia, 2 of Calloway Group's board members who had been named as executors, and me. The atmosphere in that conference room was what I would call guarded. Curtis had become CEO of Calloway Group 2 years earlier when my father stepped back due to health issues. He sat at the table with the particular settled confidence of a man who assumed the outcome of this meeting was a formality. My father sat beside him looking, as always, like he was hoping for a version of events that would make everyone comfortable. Margaret Osei read the document in the methodical, unhurried way of someone who had read many wills and understood that pace was its own form of respect for the gravity of the moment. The distribution of personal assets, the house in Ancaster, the personal savings, the vehicle, the lake property in Muskoka, were divided among family members in ways that were considered but not surprising. Then Margaret set those pages down and picked up a separate document. In addition to his personal estate, she said, Mr. Owen Calloway retained a specific provision regarding his founding shares in Calloway Group, which he never transferred and which remained in his name until his death. These shares represent a 22% stake in the company. Curtis shifted slightly in his chair. Mr. Calloway's instruction is that these shares be transferred in full to his grandson, Daniel Mercer, with the following conditions attached. The room became very still. My father looked at the table. Curtis looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who had just stepped on ice he didn't know was there. Margaret continued reading. The shares came with a shareholder rights provision that my grandfather had built into the original founding documents of Calloway Group, a provision that none of the subsequent ownership restructurings had ever dissolved because it was attached to the shares themselves, not to any individual agreement. The provision gave the holder of the founding shares first right of refusal on any major operational decision, including executive appointments, and in the event that the holder could demonstrate material harm caused by the current executive leadership, the right to call an emergency board review. My grandfather had known about that provision for decades. He had simply never needed to use it. Curtis found his voice. This doesn't change the company structure. Those are minority shares. 22% is not a minority position under the shareholder agreement, as originally written, Margaret said, and her tone was exactly as calm as it had been, reading the personal bequests. Combined with the provisions attached, Mr. Mercer has standing to request a board review. On what grounds? Curtis said. I opened the folder I had brought with me. I slid copies across the table to Margaret, to the 2 board members, to my father, the original performance reports with their timestamps, the modified versions, the forensic analysis from the Waterloo firm, showing the modification credentials, the legal opinion on what those modifications constituted under Ontario's Employment Standards Act and under the terms of the Norbridge Service Agreement. On the grounds, I said, that I was terminated based on a document that was falsified by the current CEO of this company, and that the termination caused demonstrable financial and professional harm. The forensic analysis is attached. Curtis said my name. Then he said nothing else. My father looked at the document in front of him for a long time. Then he looked up at me, and I could see in his face the particular exhaustion of a man confronting something he had, perhaps, on some level, always known was coming. I didn't feel anger in that moment. I felt something closer to grief. The emergency board review was called within 30 days. The forensic findings were independently verified. Curtis resigned before the review concluded. The legal proceedings that followed were his to navigate, and I'll leave the specifics of those out of this except to say that the Norbridge client had their own opinions about what the documentation revealed, and those opinions were expressed through their legal team. My father called me the night after Curtis resigned. He said he was sorry. He said he had suspected something wasn't right back when it happened, but that he had wanted to believe Curtis, and that wanting to believe someone you love is not the same thing as wisdom, and that he had confused the two for too long. I told him I heard him. I told him I wasn't sure yet what forgiveness looked like between us, but that I didn't want to carry hatred around for the rest of my life. We agreed to keep talking. The board asked me to take over as CEO of Calloway Group. I took a month to think about it. I walked Biscuit along the Humber River Trail every morning that month, and thought about who I was now versus who I had been when I left that building in the rain 11 years earlier. I declined the CEO position. Calloway Group was part of my history, but Meridian was what I had built. Meridian was mine in a way that Calloway could never fully be again. Instead, I joined the board as a non-executive director, with the founding shares and the standing that came with them. A professional CEO was brought in, someone with no history in the family drama, someone who could lead the company without the weight of all of it. It was the right call. Some things you walk away from, not because you lost, but because you've grown past them. I thought about my grandfather a lot in the months that followed, about the Sunday phone calls, about the stories he told me from the early years, about the specific and deliberate way he had said hold on to everything. Daniel, he had known, not everything, perhaps, but enough. He had known that Curtis was capable of what he did, or at least suspected it, and he had built a structure quietly, over years, the same way he had built the company that would protect me when I needed it. He had not rushed. He had not reacted. He had prepared. There is a letter he left for me, separate from the will, that Margaret handed me privately after the formal reading. I have read it many times. In it, he wrote that the hardest thing he ever learned in business was the difference between reacting and responding, that reacting comes from hurt and responding comes from understanding, and that the gap between them is patience. He wrote that he had watched me leave Calloway with nothing but my integrity and build something real from the ground up, and that no courtroom decision, no board meeting, no shareholder provision could have given me what I had already given myself. He wrote that the shares were not a rescue. They were a confirmation. I keep that letter in my desk, next to the sticky note that says keep going. Biscuit is 12 now, almost all gray, and he still expects his morning walk along the Humber River Trail, no matter what the Toronto weather has decided to do. On the days when it's that gray, persistent drizzle, the kind that doesn't commit to being a real storm, I think about standing on Bay Street with a cardboard box and a deactivated badge, watching the revolving door spin behind me. I was 31 years old. I thought I had lost everything. What I had actually lost was the weight of a place that was never going to value me the way I deserved to be valued. And what I found, on the other side of that loss, was the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of building something that was entirely, irrevocably my own. The person who falsified that report had been trying to remove a competitor. Instead, they had removed every obstacle between me and the life I was supposed to be living. That is the thing about people who try to shrink you through dishonesty. They are always, in the end, working against themselves. They assume that taking something from you diminishes you. They don't understand that some people are built to rebuild, and that every time you rebuild, you come back with something the first version of you didn't have, the knowledge of exactly what you are made of when everything falls away. My grandfather built Calloway Group with 2 trucks and a refusal to quit. I built Meridian with a spare bedroom and a sticky note. Neither of us waited for permission. Neither of us needed the approval of people who had already underestimated us. And neither, if you are listening to this right now, do you. If you have been pushed out of something you gave everything to, I want you to hold on to your records, your integrity, and your sense of who you are. Not because revenge is worth chasing, it isn't. Not as an end in itself, but because the truth has a way of organizing itself around evidence, And the people who build real things have a way of outlasting the people who only know how to take credit for them. Build something. Be patient. Keep going.